Less than 24 hours since landing in Melbourne, tennis's number one is fighting deportation. Djokovic flew in after clearing 2 independent panels with his medical exemption, but lost his next round to Border Force, which cancelled his visa at 10 a.m. today.
Unvaccinated people, as a general rule, cannot come into Australia unless there's a medical exemption.
He was detained at the airport for hours before being transferred to a hotel quarantine facility. Explanations have been chaotic, with the Victorian and federal governments giving very different versions of events.
Last night, the Commonwealth contacted a number of Victorian government agencies to inquire whether we would support an individual visa application for him to enter Australia.
There was no inquiries being made about support for a visa application, I'm advised.
Someone issued Novak Djokovic a visa, and it wasn't the Victorian government.
The PM citing a letter from his health minister back in November.
I can confirm that people who contracted COVID-19 within the past 6 months and seek to enter Australia from overseas and have not received 2 doses of a TGA-approved or TGA-recognised vaccine are not considered fully vaccinated.
There are reports up to 3 other players may have entered the country using similar exemptions. This afternoon, Djokovic launched a court challenge against his detention.
Accepted, he got an exemption, he should not be treated this way.
The situation has fired everyone up. Serbia's president vowing diplomatic pressure.
Serbia will fight for Novak.
Novak's father trying to rally protests.
If they don't let him go in half an hour, we'll gather in the streets. This is a battle for everyone.
And the Joker's fans swarming Melbourne Airport. So, can Novak pull off a legal win and get one court to let him back on to another?
Paul McNamee is the former director of the Australian Open and he joins us now. Paul, can you work it out? What's gone wrong here?
Well, I think I can. The Prime Minister gave it away a bit when he said that those who've had COVID in the last 6 months are not eligible for a medical exemption at border control. But that's clearly the reason that Novak got the green light from Victoria's Department of Health. Vic Health said you can get a medical exemption for a number of reasons, of which that is one of them. So we've got a disconnect, again, between the federal government and the state government on what constitutes a medical exemption. That's where we are.
But he did walk through a number of gates that he was allowed through. He applied for a visa and got it, and that's the federal government's responsibility. He boarded a plane where that was checked, that arrived in Australia. It was only then that questions started to be asked. We've seen record numbers of finger-pointing going on today. Who do you think is at fault?
Well, of course, what happened was, like every player in visit to the Australian Open, you fill in a Class 408 visa. That you walk through that process with Tennis Australia, essentially, because they walk you through the online process. That was granted. Because he hadn't had a vaccination, clearly he needed a medical exemption. He applied for that and was granted it. But that just opened the floodgates of unpopularity, because clearly he's not popular here. And so everybody thought, OK, we're going to need to look at this under a microscope just in case there's a little problem. And, of course, what they found was, it seems to me, that the reasons that he got the medical exemption, according to the Australian Open and Vic Health's rules, did not comply, according to, as you heard the Prime Minister say, with recent COVID breaching the federal government border control rules. So how could a foreign player ever know that? I mean, players rely in good faith on the information that they're given. They apply in good faith. So this is a really bad look.
It seems quite intricate, Paul. Do you think they should have got Hawkeye involved?
Yeah, well, look, I think as a nation we're better than this. I mean, I know he's not popular, but he is the #1 player in the world. He did get a visa. He did get an exemption. Whether people like the fact that those rules exist, they do exist for Australians as well, by the way. And now he's been told he's got to, take his. It's not a bat and ball; it's a racket and ball. And I think he's in deep trouble. I think he's in a lot of trouble now.
All of that said, do you understand why a lot of Australians might be quite happy to see the back of him?
Yes, I mean that's clear, because he clearly has a different view on vaccinations than the average Australian has. I mean, we get that. I mean, it's not the view I hold or you hold, but at the end of the day, people do have those views and they have a right to it. And if they'd have made the rule no vaccinations, not in, fine. I mean, he took his chance with this exemption process. I mean, he didn't create the exemption process, so he took his chance. If he wasn't exempted, he wouldn't be here. But he followed the rules in good faith. So I think it's very, very harsh.
Well, it certainly looks like a mess on the international stage as well as locally. Paul McNamee, great to get your perspective. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Well, joining us now is former Immigration Department Deputy Secretary Abul Rizvi. Abul, why are you critical of the federal government's handling of this?
Well, we need to understand that Australia's visa system provides 3 levels of protection. The first level is the visa itself. And it seems Mr Djokovic was granted a visa on the assumption that all the legal requirements had been met. The government is now saying all the legal requirements had not been met. The second layer is when the person boards an aeroplane to come to Australia. There are Australian Border Force officers there who can prevent a person boarding an aeroplane to Australia if there are issues with the visa. Now, that was only some 24 to 48 hours ago, I understand, and yet no action was taken to prevent Mr Djokovic boarding. Action finally took place at the third layer of protection, and that's at an Australian airport. But that is the last layer at which the protection should be applied, because applying the protection at that level creates enormous amounts of chaos at Australian airports. And as international travel ramps up, the system the government has in place at the moment, if Mr Djokovic's case is a template, our airports just simply will not be able to cope.
Well, as a former Immigration Department official, does any responsibility for what's happened fall to the state Victorian government?
Yes, I do believe it does. The first is this blind medical assessment process seems quite contrived and quite bizarre. You make good decisions by talking to the applicant, asking them questions, considering their responses. You can't make good decisions just on the paperwork when such critical decisions are being made. Secondly, I don't believe the Victorian government should have announced the outcome of that medical exemption process without prior consultation with the Department of Home Affairs, and that consultation does not appear to have taken place.
Novak has launched an appeal in the federal court. Can you explain what avenue can he challenge this on?
Well, if I was Mr Djokovic's lawyer, there would be 3 questions I would be asking. The first question I would be asking is, if my client had not met all of the legal requirements for a visa, why did you grant him a visa? The second question I would ask is, if you had concerns about my client's visa, why did you not cancel that visa prior to him boarding a plane to Australia? And the third question I would ask is, given that you granted my client a visa and none of the circumstances prior to grant have changed since that time, on what basis can you cancel that visa?
Well, there are reports 2 other players with exemptions have been allowed in. Do you think Novak's being treated differently here?
Oh, look, Peter, that's a very difficult one. I don't know the circumstances of those other 2 cases. It may well have been that their visas were granted on the basis of a different process. Perhaps they did provide all of the relevant documentation to the Department of Home Affairs that did enable it to make a decision on their visas. I don't know. We can only be speculating, but it does look rather odd.
That's what I do. Well, I asked the tough questions, mate. You answered all the other ones, but you had trouble with mine. I asked the tough questions.
Thank you very much for your time tonight, and thanks for that very impressive use of numbered bullet points. So, pretty amazing.
Oh. I'm sorry, the public servant in me still hangs in there.